There are things that seem impossible to separate: Batman and Gotham, Maradona and the ball, Jordan and the Chicago Bulls. The image is engraved in the collective memory, number 23 in the red jersey flying toward the hoop, lifting 6 trophies. But what almost no one tells is that this union, which today seems like destiny written in stone, was several times on the verge of breaking. What makes this story so brutal is the contrast. The man who defined the identity of a franchise, the guy who turned Chicago into the center of the universe, was seen more than once as someone expendable. There were executives who wanted to trade him for a safe center, offers that tempted him with new destinations, and even moments when he himself stood his ground and said, "Like this, I'm not continuing. We're not going to give anything away yet, but imagine what it would mean to see Jordan wearing another jersey." The greatest player of all time turned into the face of another franchise. It's an idea that seems absurd, and yet more than once it was dangerously close to being real. The 1984 draft is now remembered as one of the most legendary of all time. Hakeem Olajuwon, Charles Barkley, John Stockton, and Michael Jordan, of course. But at that precise moment, things weren't so clear. In the NBA of the 80s, there was an unwritten rule: if you wanted to win titles, you needed a center. Teams were built from the inside out around a giant who dominated the paint. The Lakers had Kareem, the Sixers had Moses Malone, the Celtics had Robert Parrish. Without a big man, you were doomed. Chicago arrived at that draft with the 3rd pick, and although it sounds ridiculous today, the initial plan wasn't to pick Jordan. The management was desperate to get a center. They were afraid of ending up with a spectacular shooting guard, but useless for winning championships. And that's why they started offering that pick as if it were a bargaining chip. The Clippers were the first to tempt them. They put Terry Cummings on the table, a young athletic power forward already established with more than 20 points per game and a couple of all-star appearances in sight. At that time, it seemed like a reasonable deal, trading an unknown college player for someone already producing in the NBA. The problem was that no one could imagine that that kid from pick 3 would become the greatest player in history. And that wasn't the only offer. Atlanta also picked up the phone. They proposed Tree Rollins, a 7'1" center who intimidated on defense, a shot-blocking specialist. The detail: he averaged only 9 points and 8 rebounds. He was decent, nothing more. But the Bulls were so obsessed with finding their big man that they almost handed over the key to their future in exchange for a merely solid player. Imagine that scenario for a second. Michael Jordan would never have worn a Bulls jersey. There would have been no rings in Chicago, no Last Dance. All because in 1984, the front office thought a shooting guard could never lead a team to the top, a decision driven more by the prejudices of the time than by vision for the future. It's a brutal reminder of how close history came to veering off course. The pick that seemed secondary, the choice that didn't fit the logic of the 80s, turned out to be the spark that set the NBA on fire. And the spiciest part, the Bulls almost gave it away before opening the envelope. What almost no one knows is that Michael Jordan was this close to being traded. For Julius Erving? Yes, the Dr. J himself, one of the greatest icons in NBA history, the man who had revolutionized the game with his aerial style. But in 1984, things weren't so simple. Erving was entering the final stretch of his career, and the Sixers were starting to think about a replacement. Philadelphia's owner, Harold Katz, had followed Jordan closely at North Carolina. For him, that kid was Erving's natural heir. The same flair, the same ability to soar toward the basket, the sense that he could turn basketball into a show. Katz believed in that idea so much that he picked up the phone and offered Dr. J in exchange for Chicago's number 3 pick. Think about it for a second. The Bulls, struggling with attendance and a weak roster, could have accepted. Having Erving, even in the twilight of his career, meant filling arenas immediately. It was a marketing bombshell, a magnet for ticket and jersey sales. Who wouldn't want to see Julius Erving live, even if he wasn't the same as before? The incredible thing is that the deal was close to happening. Katz later said that he practically had everything cooked up with the Bulls owner. It was the general manager, Rod Thorne, who stopped the trade at the last moment and bet on Jordan instead, a decision that changed the history of Chicago and of the entire NBA. Imagine that alternate scenario: Dr. J playing his final years in Chicago and Jordan starting his career in Philadelphia alongside Charles Barkley, who had arrived in that same draft. 2 young monsters, Jordan and Barkley, growing together in the Eastern Conference. The Sixers, who had already been champions in 1983 with Moses Malone, could have built another dynasty. But it didn't happen. The Bulls said no. And that no was probably the most important no in the franchise's history. Because instead of a finales full of sold-out crowds and Dr. J nostalgia, Chicago kept the future, a kid from North Carolina who was about to change the rules of the game forever. There's one of those stories that sounds made up, but it's not. Michael Jordan was just a couple of signatures away from becoming a Houston Rockets player. And not only that, from being part of a trio that sounds like a team created in a video game. In the '84 draft, Houston had the first pick and selected Hakeem Olajuwon. That's unquestionable. unstoppable. He was a dominant center, the kind of player every team dreamed of having. The second pick belonged to Portland, and that's where the chaos began. The Blazers already had Clyde Drexler, a young, talented shooting guard who had yet to fully explode, and they didn't want to add another guard. So they came up with the idea of offering Drexler plus their number 2 pick in exchange for Ralph Sampson, the 7'4" giant already in Houston. If the Rockets had accepted, they would have ended up with both the number 1 and number 2 picks. In other words, Olajuwon and Jordan. And on top of that, Drexler in the package. Imagine a team starting the 80s with those 3 names, Hakeem, Drexler, and Jordan. A combination so absurd it would have brought the super team concept forward by 15 years. The problem was that Ralph Sampson was too valuable at the time. He had just been Rookie of the Year, was putting up impressive numbers, and the idea of pairing him with Olajuwon in the paint was irresistible. That's how Houston's Twin Towers era was born. No one could foresee that injuries would ruin Sampson's career and that the experiment wouldn't last long. The irony is that by holding on to Sampson, Houston missed the chance to build the wildest trio in basketball history. Think about it for a second. Jordan and Drexler flying on the wings, Olajuwon dominating in the paint. 3 future Hall of Famers on the same team, just beginning their careers. They would have destroyed the league before the Bulls even dreamed of a championship ring. It's one of those parallel universes that's impossible to ignore. Because while in Chicago, the executives doubted whether Jordan could lead a team, in Houston, he was one step away from joining the most talented team of all time. And it all fell apart because a 7'4" man with fragile knees seemed, at that moment, a safer bet than a shooting guard fresh out of college. By 1988, Michael Jordan was no longer a promise. He was a fully established star. He had already won scoring titles, filled arenas in every city, and turned the Bulls into a media phenomenon. But incredible as it may seem, there were still doubts within the franchise itself, and the man behind those doubts had a name and a surname: Jerry Krause. The Chicago general manager saw Jordan as a problem. He considered him arrogant, selfish, incapable of leading a team. According to Krause, his individualistic style would always clash with what he called true team basketball. And the worst part was that these criticisms didn't come from journalists. They came from the man pulling the strings of the organization. That year, the tension reached a breaking point. Krause had already traded Charles Oakley, Jordan's best friend, which had him furious. But what nearly blew everything up was a secret plan to send Michael Jordan to Los Angeles in exchange for the number 1 and number 6 picks of the 1988 draft. The interested team, the Clippers. Yes, the Clippers. A franchise that at the time was little more than a joke, a machine built to lose, was just a few steps away from landing the best player on the planet. And the most shocking part is that Chicago's own management was willing to listen. Krause fantasized about rebuilding from scratch, about picking obedient young players instead of continuing to bet on a Jordan who publicly challenged his authority. If that deal had gone through, NBA history would have split in 2. The Bulls would never have built their 1990s dynasty. And the Clippers, yes, the Clippers could have become a powerhouse ahead of their time, with Jordan as their cornerstone. In that draft, with those picks, players like Danny Manning and Hersey Hawkins were selected. Good players, sure, but comparable to Michael Jordan, not even in dreams. The most ironic thing of all is that while the entire planet saw Jordan as the future of basketball, within his own organization, they saw him as a problem to solve. Chicago came one move away from becoming the franchise that let the greatest of all time slip away, and it was Krause's pride that took things so far as to put that ticking bomb on the table. If there's one thing that always defined Michael Jordan, it was loyalty. He could be ruthless with rivals and teammates, he could push people to the point of humiliation, but if someone earned his trust, he would defend them to the end. And in the 80s, that person was Charles Oakley. Oakley wasn't just a tough, hard-nosed power forward, he was Jordan's bodyguard on the court. If someone tried to hit him with a hard foul, Oakley was there to hit back 10 times harder. If a message needed to be sent physically, he was the one to deliver it, and off the court, they were inseparable. Jordan trusted very few people, and Oakley was one of those few. That's why when in 1988 Jerry Krause decided to trade him to the Knicks in exchange for Bill Cartwright, it felt like a stab in the back. Jordan took it as a personal betrayal. It wasn't just a player swap, it was tearing away his friend, his shield, the man who protected him from the brutality of 1980s NBA basketball. From a front office perspective, Krause's logic made sense. Chicago needed a center, and Cartwright filled that gap. But what he never understood was the emotional cost. For Jordan, it was a declaration of war. That trade confirmed to him that Krause didn't respect him, that he was willing to break any bond to impose his own plan. From that moment on, the relationship between Jordan and the front office entered a point of no return. His distrust toward Krause became permanent, and the rumor that MJ was willing to leave Chicago started growing stronger than ever, because if they take away your best best friend, on your bodyguard, how committed can you really remain to that franchise? That trade was much more than a market move. It was the emotional breaking point that made it clear Jordan and Krause could not coexist without conflict, and that at any moment, the best player on the planet could decide it was no longer worth staying in Chicago. If the Dr. J proposal already sounded insane, Philadelphia didn't stop there. In the mid-80s, they came back with an even more serious offer. The goal was still the same, to get Jordan at any cost, and the centerpiece of the deal was none other than Charles Barkley. The Sixers put a package on the table that included Barkley, Andrew Toney, and Clement Johnson. Think about that for a second. Barkley was a young player already destined to become a superstar. Explosive, dominant on the boards, a guy who played as if he were 7 feet tall even though he barely reached 6 feet 6 inches. Alongside him, they offered Toney, a scoring guard with all-star talent, and a backup center to strengthen the paint. From a purely logical standpoint, it was a tempting deal. Chicago would get a future MVP in Barkley, a solid scorer in Toney, and a big man to fill gaps. It was a complete, balanced package, the kind of offer any general manager would seriously consider. But the thing was, Jordan was no longer just a promising rookie, he was exploding as a cultural phenomenon. Every night, he did something that made headlines. Every play was turning into a poster. And even though Chicago's front office analyzed the trade in detail, they finally understood that no one, not even a prime Barkley, could match what Jordan represented at that moment. What this story makes clear is that Jordan's future in Chicago was never guaranteed. It wasn't a perfect marriage from the start, but a relationship full of doubts, tensions, and temptations. The Bulls could have traded him for Cummings, for Dr. J, for Barkley, and they were just a couple of signatures away from doing it. And had they accepted that offer, the future would have been an earthquake. Barkley in Chicago leading the Bulls without Jordan, and Jordan in Philadelphia teaming up with a still dominant Moses Malone. Two franchises completely transformed. The NBA of the 90s could have been something entirely different, and all because for a brief moment, the idea that Jordan might not be enough came dangerously close to becoming reality. The tension between Jordan and Jerry Krause had been simmering for years, but in 1998 it reached a breaking point. The Bulls were a consolidated dynasty, 5 titles in 7 years, the most dominant franchise on the planet, a global phenomenon. But while the world saw an invincible team, inside Chicago an internal war was unfolding. Krause wanted to leave his mark, to prove that success didn't depend solely on Jordan or the stars, but on his own ability as the team's architect. And in that crusade, he decided to cut out Phil Jackson, the coach who had managed egos and turned raw talent into a winning system. Krause even announced before the season began that it would be Phil's last year. For Jordan, that was a direct provocation. He made it clear, I will only play for Phil Jackson. That ultimatum was non-negotiable. He could endure anything, criticism, betrayals, trade rumors, but he wasn't willing to stay on a team without the man who had transformed the Bulls into a winning machine. The result was what we now know as The Last Dance, a season lived as a farewell with the shadow of a breakup hanging over every game. And although they captured their 6th championship, Jordan kept his word. When Phil left, he stepped off the ship too. There was another detail that reinforced that decision. An injury to his right index finger suffered in a golf accident. It wasn't devastating, but it was enough to make him doubt how much longer he could maintain his trademark level of competitiveness. Combined with physical wear and his open conflict with Krause, the conclusion became inevitable. Jordan retired from the Bulls at the top. What's curious is that, at the time, many didn't see it as a pure retirement, but rather as an act of protest, a coded message. Without Phil, I'm not playing. It was his way of proving that the titles weren't the product of Krause's ego or front office wizardry, but of a formula built between the players and their coach. That's how the most glorious dynasty in NBA history came to an end. Not defeated on the court, but dismantled from within. Not by rivals, but by a cold war between its star and its general manager. After 1998, the entire world believed Michael Jordan had written the perfect ending to his story in Chicago. The shot against Utah, the 6th ring, the image frozen in collective memory. But the truth is, Jordan didn't retire because he wanted to stop playing basketball. He left because he refused to play without Phil Jackson. And that decision opened up a fascinating question. What would have happened if instead of retiring, he had followed his coach? Fate had it that Phil Jackson signed the following year with the Lakers. And these weren't just any Lakers, they were the team of Shaquille O'Neal in his prime and a young, hungry Kobe Bryant who was beginning to turn into a superstar. Imagine Jordan walking into that locker room. A veteran Jordan, still fiercely competitive, sharing the court with Shaq, the most dominant force in the paint at the time, and with Kobe, who saw in him his mirror, his role model. It would have been an explosive mix. Jordan's mentality, Kobe's youth, and Shaq's raw power, all under Phil Jackson's zen direction. There were even pieces that could have completed the circle. Dennis Rodman had briefly passed through the Lakers, and Ron Harper, another of Chicago's old soldiers, was was already there. It would have been, quite literally, an extension of the Bulls on the West Coast. The question is inevitable. How many more rings would Jordan have won with that team? The Lakers, without him, managed a three-peat between 2000 and 2002. With MJ in the equation, the story might have been even crueler for the rest of the league, because when Shaq and Kobe clashed over egos, Jordan would have been there to restore order, and if there was anyone with the moral authority to silence both, it was him. That scenario never came to be, but it's impossible not to imagine it. Jordan could have ended his career in purple and gold, adding more titles and turning the Lakers into the undisputed dynasty of two different eras. Instead, he chose to freeze his legacy in Chicago, with that final shot as his epitaph. The story of Michael Jordan in Chicago seems written to be perfect. The hero arrives, transforms a forgotten franchise, and turns it into a dynasty. But behind that epic tale lies an uncomfortable truth. Several times, it almost didn't happen. The Bulls doubted him in 1984, put him on the trading block in 1988, took away his allies, and ultimately pushed him to retire in 1998. Jordan could have been a Clipper, a Sixer, even a Rocket. He might even have donned purple and gold to extend his career in Los Angeles. None of that happened. He stayed in Chicago, and with that, the legend was built. But the question lingers. Would Jordan be the same myth if any of those decisions had gone through? Or was what made him eternal precisely his choice to stay put, resist temptation, and leave his mark in a single place? Sometimes, what doesn't happen weighs as much as what does. And in Jordan's case, what never happened reminds us how close the NBA came to being a completely different sport. Drop your thoughts in the comments section. This was Hoop Secrets, and I'll see you next time.